The International Monetary Fund is sounding the alarm, warning that the United States is losing its long-held influence over the global financial system at a speed few expected. More and more countries are moving away from the dollar and leaning toward China's yuan, and the pace of this transition is accelerating. China has pushed an enormous wave of credit into the world economy, over $2 trillion in just the first 3 quarters of the year, drawing governments into its financial orbit with remarkable force. Washington understands what this means. Confidence in the dollar has weakened after years of unpredictable trade decisions, shifting tariffs, and political turbulence that have shaken global trust. China, on the other hand, has presented itself as a reliable financier, offering cheaper loans, more flexible repayment terms, and an expanding monetary system that operates independently of American influence. For many nations searching for stability, China's offer is becoming the more appealing option, which explains the IMF's unusually blunt warnings. China's recent financial activity makes the situation even clearer. The People's Bank of China reported roughly 15 trillion yuan in new lending during the first 10 months of 2025, about $2.1 trillion USD. A single country injecting that much capital into international markets in such a short period signals strategic intent, not routine economic management. China's domestic challenges, sluggish exports, weak real estate markets, and reduced foreign demand have driven Beijing to unleash massive credit expansion. But instead of keeping that stimulus at home, China is using its financial power to elevate the yuan's global role. Every new swap line, overseas loan, or currency agreement not only supports China's internal economy, but also gradually weakens the dollar's dominant position. A large part of China's approach revolves around its network of currency swap agreements, which give foreign central banks direct access to yuan liquidity, while bypassing the US dollar entirely. These arrangements look like friendly economic cooperation, but they also create structural dependence on China's financial stability. The results are becoming visible around the developing world, especially in Latin America. During a major forum in May 2025, President Xi Jinping introduced a 66 billion yuan credit line for Latin American countries, followed by commitments to more than 100 joint projects involving infrastructure, energy, and digital technology. These initiatives do more than fund growth. They tie nations into financial systems built around the yuan rather than the dollar. China's influence becomes even stronger through infrastructure investments. Researchers have found that Chinese companies now hold stakes or operational control in 31 ports across Latin America and the Caribbean, many positioned along crucial shipping routes. Control over ports means control over supply chains, and control over supply chains inevitably leads to political influence. At the same time, offshore yuan markets and dim sum bonds have expanded rapidly, giving foreign governments and companies new ways to raise capital directly in Chinese currency. This kind of financial framework barely existed 20 years ago. Yet today, it is reshaping how global capital moves. The United States, meanwhile, is operating under high interest rates that make borrowing in dollars extremely costly for developing nations. China's lower-cost yuan loans look far more attractive in comparison, prompting even major economies to rethink their relationships. Argentina is one of the clearest examples. It increased its swap deal with China to allow trade and borrowing directly in yuan, reducing reliance on the dollar. For Washington, this is a dangerous shift. Latin America has long been considered an American sphere of influence, yet growing reliance on Chinese money, infrastructure, and financial systems is pulling countries toward Beijing. This shift has forced the Trump administration to react quickly. In an attempt to counter China's influence in Argentina, the U.S. Treasury under Scott Bessent negotiated a $20 billion swap agreement with President Javier Milei. On the surface, this seems like a strong reassertion of American power. But the reality is far more complicated. Argentina's trade with China continues to rise, not fall, despite U.S. support. After Argentina removed export duties on key agricultural goods, Chinese companies bought around 7 million tons of Argentine soybeans. A major boost for Argentina, but a significant loss for American farmers who were pushed out of that market. To many in the United States, it looks like Washington is pouring money into a country that is simultaneously strengthening its economic ties with China. Financial tensions are just as glaring, even though U.S. officials insist the agreement with Argentina is not a bailout. American banks are already discussing an additional $20 billion in lending, which could push total U.S. assistance toward $40 billion. Yet Argentina keeps expanding its yuan-based agreements and deepening its financial connections to China. The irony is striking. As American farmers lose access to Chinese buyers, The US government is helping Argentina gain even more access to them. Washington is spending billions to keep Argentina within its sphere of influence, while Argentina uses that breathing room to move even closer to Beijing. China is no longer simply competing through trade or investments. It is building a separate financial ecosystem designed to function outside the dollar entirely. Over the last 5 years, Chinese banks have quadrupled their overseas yuan lending, deposits, and bond activity, reaching more than 3.4 trillion yuan. This is not ordinary growth. It is the creation of a parallel financial system. At the heart of this system is China's cross-border interbank payment system, or CPS. While still smaller than SWIFT, it is expanding rapidly, processing trillions of yuan in payments each year, and giving countries under sanctions or facing dollar shortages a lifeline. As this system grows, global trade flows shift with it. More oil, gas, metals, and agricultural products than ever are now being settled in yuan, especially in trade between China and Russia. Brazil and China have also formalized yuan-based settlement for major commodities like soybeans and iron ore, allowing billions in trade to bypass the dollar completely. The yuan has recently overtaken the euro as the world's second most widely used currency for trade settlement, and its influence within the IMF's reserve basket has also increased. At the same time, China is pushing its digital yuan across borders, laying the groundwork for an even larger role in global finance. These developments give countries real reasons to begin loosening their dependence on dollar-centric financial systems. As this new network grows, its influence spreads quickly across international markets. Nations that once relied almost automatically on dollar-issued debt are now shifting parts of their sovereign obligations into yuan, because doing so is cheaper and more manageable. Kenya, Sri Lanka, and several others have already started refinancing old liabilities or releasing new bonds in Chinese currency. Even US-friendly governments across Latin America are turning toward Chinese-backed lending structures through BRICS institutions instead of traditional Western sources like the World Bank or the Inter-American Development Bank. This marks a genuine and ongoing transformation. Every yuan-based loan, swap line, or settlement reduces the dollar's automatic centrality in global trade. China is not merely advertising its currency. It is quietly replacing the structural pieces of the old dollar-dominated order with its own alternative framework. Meanwhile, Donald Trump has begun raising alarms about what he believes is a severe threat. He publicly warned that the US could face both economic and national security fallout if the Supreme Court overturned his tariff measures. In doing so, intentionally or not, he is acknowledging that America's ability to influence the global financial system is slipping. The long-standing order that upheld dollar supremacy is weakening, and trust in US economic leadership abroad is fading. Understanding how this happened is crucial. Trump used emergency powers under the International Emergency Economic Powers Act to impose broad tariffs on nearly every major trading partner. Their scale and unpredictability shocked markets. Countries started questioning whether they could rely on the dollar when US trade policies seemed to shift suddenly and without strategic direction. Even the Supreme Court has suggested the legal basis for these tariffs may not stand. Inside the US, this atmosphere strikes at the heart of the financial system. Investors who once treated US Treasury bonds as unquestionably safe are reassessing the risks of a country that appears increasingly isolated in trade and erratic in economic decision-making. As trust weakens, so do the inherent advantages of the dollar. Demand for treasuries may fall, borrowing costs could rise, and America risks losing the effortless financial authority it has long enjoyed. While the US dealt with internal volatility, China pursued the opposite path, expanding currency swap networks, increasing yuan-based lending, and strengthening ties with nations wanting predictable alternatives to the dollar. China didn't need dramatic announcements. It built a parallel system piece by piece, and allowed dissatisfied countries to join it voluntarily. The result is becoming clear. More nations are settling trade in yuan, and fewer rely solely on the dollar. This trend is what pushed the International Monetary Fund to issue a rare warning. Though the IMF publicly urges countries to move cautiously toward the yuan and align any changes with long-term reserve strategies, its tone reveals how fragile the situation has become. Beneath the surface, global monetary authorities are already shifting. Throughout 2025, data showed that central banks expect to increase their gold reserves while cutting back on dollar assets. A major World Gold Council survey found that 76% of central banks plan to accumulate more gold within the next 5 years, while 73% anticipate lowering the share of dollars they hold. These aren't symbolic tweaks. They signal deep concerns about the long-term reliability of the dollar. The most striking development is that central banks, for the first time in decades, now collectively hold more gold than U.S. Treasury securities. This milestone reveals how far confidence in the dollar has fallen, and why the IMF is increasingly uneasy. Countries aren't simply choosing yuan over dollars. They are diversifying into assets that free them from reliance on any dominant currency at all. From Washington's viewpoint, this trend is a genuine threat. While the IMF discourages rapid shifts toward the yuan, central banks are already making decisions based on different assessments of future risk, buying gold, reducing dollar exposure, and adopting new financial tools that lessen dependence on the United States. The system the IMF is trying to defend is slipping away even as it warns the world to slow down. This leads to the central question that will shape the next decade. If much of the world is already preparing institutions and policies for a future that does not revolve around the dollar, is the United States prepared for that reality? Or has the moment to respond effectively already passed? Evidence suggests the U.S. is stuck between denial and hesitation. While China steadily builds new financial pathways, expands UN liquidity channels, and deepens partnerships across continents, the U.S. remains entangled in political divisions, inconsistent trade actions, and an inability to articulate a long-term economic direction. Dollar dominance was never guaranteed by economic power alone. It depended on trust, stability, and the belief that American institutions were reliable and predictable. When those foundations crack, the structural benefits weaken. The shift in the global monetary system will not unfold overnight, and the dollar will not collapse suddenly. But what we may be witnessing is the start of a slow, irreversible transition. A world where the dollar still matters, but no longer stands unchallenged. Where American influence gradually shrinks, until Washington realizes it can no longer dictate global terms as it once did. Where the yuan doesn't need to replace the dollar, only weaken its monopoly enough to create a multipolar financial landscape. For Americans, the implications are serious. Dollar dominance allowed the U.S. to run large trade deficits, borrow at lower costs, and exert unmatched geopolitical influence. If that advantage fades, the consequences will be wide-reaching. The IMF's warning is not about protecting global stability. It is about protecting a system that has disproportionately favored the United States for nearly 80 years. But systems built on trust fall apart when trust evaporates, and right now the U.S. is giving the world reasons to look elsewhere. Whether the U.S. can reverse this direction remains uncertain. Doing so would require major changes in economic policy, trade relations, and political stability, changes that seem unlikely given current domestic divisions. It would require rebuilding global trust that took decades to earn but only years to erode. It would require offering developing countries better economic partnerships than China provides, not through intimidation, but through genuine opportunity. Instead, we see temporary fixes like emergency swap lines, tariff threats that push nations further away from the dollar, and institutional warnings that identify the problems but offer no workable solutions. China, on the other hand, continues building quietly, expanding infrastructure, issuing credit, establishing swap lines, and forming long-term relationships that make the yuan increasingly difficult to avoid. Beijing understands that modern financial power is built through networks, not confrontation, and that is exactly what it is doing. The era of unquestioned dollar supremacy that followed World War II is ending. The world is moving toward fragmented financial systems where multiple currencies compete for influence and U.S. leverage declines year after year. The IMF's call for caution confirms that this shift is already happening. The debate is no longer about whether a change is coming. It is about whether the United States can adapt to a global order it must now share with China. The real story of this century is being written in currency moves, central bank strategies, and infrastructure built across emerging economies.